welcome back to Something to Noodle On. I'm your host, Mac and Cheese Please, but you can call me Mac. I wanted to remind you all that you can dive into the conversation too by joining our Discord or following us on Twitter at A Pod to Noodle On. Oh, and you can also get the podcast a day early by joining our Patreon. But all right, let's dive into it, shall we? This year, I've been taking a lot more trips back to back than I have basically in my entire life. And it got me thinking about how travel truly affects our lives. So today, I'd like to discuss some benefits of travel and what we can learn as we visit all these various places, and what might be some of those drawbacks of not taking the time to explore the world around us. 3 years ago, the world changed when the pandemic hit and completely disrupted our usual routines by placing all sorts of limits on our lives. An industry that probably saw the most changes was the travel industry. Suddenly, we're no longer able to travel far from home or go to events with lots of people or even explore more remote locations because of all the transit through these high population areas. These days, most of the restrictions have been lifted, and we have more freedom to go wherever we choose, whenever we choose. For me, travel is a huge part of my life. I travel for work, I travel for social engagements, and I travel just to satisfy my own curiosity for new and exciting places. Without travel, our lives feel a little less fruitful and satisfying because there are so many benefits we receive when we get to leave our surroundings in exchange for some really cool adventures. All right, so what are some of these benefits? Well, travel offers us more than just a chance to see places and landmarks that we don't typically see in our normal surroundings. Sure, we can still learn a lot about the world around us, but more importantly, we get to learn more about ourselves and our close friends and family, our significant others, and all the people who inhabit the area we're visiting. For example, we learn a lot about who we are as people when we visit new places or even revisit old ones. Whenever we're faced with the prospect of going somewhere new, I'm sure the first thing many of us do is hit up Google Maps or TripAdvisor or even Yelp to find out what the best things to do in the area are. Or if you're like me, maybe you like to open up Zillow to see what kind of houses are for sale. I know I'm not moving to these locations and I'm probably never going to buy these houses, but hey, it's a guilty pleasure. As for travel, even if we don't plan out our days fully, it's still a good idea to go in with some sort of idea of what to do when not wrapped up in the priorities that brought us to the location in the first place. When exploring a new place, the landmarks and establishments that we're drawn to sort of paint a picture of our personalities. We tend to choose our recreation based on things we know we already like, as well as things we think we might like, while avoiding the options that don't sound appealing to us at all. It's in that middle zone of things that we might like that we tend to learn the most about ourselves. Perhaps we decide to spend a night hitting up the casinos in Las Vegas, or we plan an intense trip hiking in a national park. Even things that we might not typically do, like plan a day going ziplining or whitewater rafting. Whatever it is that we've planned, we know there's a chance we might have the time of our lives, or we might end up hating everything. Either way, we learn something about ourselves just because we're experiencing something new. There's a lot to be said about the places we return to time and time again, as well as how the ratio of new things versus familiar things changes. In my own life, I've noticed a significant change when I moved to a new state. Originally, I'm from Illinois. I've also lived in South Carolina, Nebraska, Nevada, and now Washington. It's when I moved to a new area away from my family, all the friends I made, the places I like to go, did I find that I grew as a person. Think about it like this. When you stay in your hometown, you have a group of friends that always likes to go to the same bar on Fridays. Week after week, you go to that same bar for the same specials. Maybe you don't even like that bar, but what else are you going to do if all your friends are going? So you suck it up and you go. But when you're living in a place where you don't have any friends, or you don't have that established group of friends yet that make the plans for you, You need to figure out what you like to do for fun to feel socially fulfilled. You might learn that you actually love Indian food or you love rock climbing and it's a really fun hobby. These are all things that you may never have tried because you've been living in a place that has been holding you back, whether it's limitations to these actual activities or maybe your friends never wanted to do any of those things either. We can experience travel in all sorts of different ways, one of them being traveling in groups. We get a chance to learn more about our friends and family when we travel with them than without. I'd go out on a limb and say most people don't enjoy traveling alone. It typically tends to be more fun when we have someone to share these new experiences with. You really get a sense of who a person is when you take them out of their comfort of their own home. When traveling with friends, you learn to compromise on eating schedules, showering, and any activities y'all want to do together. Of course, you may not always agree, and group trips can often lead to some pretty big fights, but making those memories that we can recall with those same people later on is really what it's all about. For me, I got to go on a trip to Mexico with my friend Nikki. It was supposed to be a girls' trip with the 5 of us. We were all going to go to Playa del Carmen, but everyone backed out except for my ride or die, Nikki. Lucky for me, Nikki is a huge planner and speaks Spanish. We had an entire itinerary planned out and booked 4 months before we left. While in Mexico, we had so much fun together. We were already planning out where we want to go next year, and we talked about making this girls' trip an annual thing. Hopefully the rest of my girlies don't bail, but hey, it is what it is. At least I got Nikki by my side, am I right? Well, traveling with friends is great, but it can also be a make it or break it point for a lot of romantic relationships, especially in the beginning. In movies and TV, we frequently see plot points that revolve around a couple's first big weekend away together. Whether in a dramatic series or a sitcom, we easily recognize the potential speed bumps ahead because traveling together is rarely an event where everything goes perfectly. From the moment we pull out of the driveway and hit the open road, we're met with so much potential friction. If it's a long road trip, say more than 6 hours, you're met with the very stark realization that you are now stuck inside a vehicle with this person for the foreseeable future. And you both want to avoid the dreaded awkward silence or any tense moments of conversation. Like, what happens if you're 60% of the way to your destination and you discover a deal breaker about this potential person, your romantic interest? There are a few potential options in this scenario. You insist on turning around, or you make the most of your weekend together. When it comes to travel, you find out a lot about a person when they're put in unfamiliar situations and surroundings. You can discover really quickly if this is a person who lives life in the moment and runs with the bulls, or if there's someone who is too close-minded and won't try the local delicacy because it looks or smells weird. I think there's an old saying, or maybe I just completely made this up. Either way, it's really good advice. It goes something along the lines of, don't marry someone you've never traveled out of the country with. How they act when pressure is on could be a complete deal breaker for you. Of course, best case scenario is everything turns out great and you return home without any significantly damning, relationship altering revelations. In fact, I'm sure that's what we're all hoping for when we travel with our romantic partners, new or old. But honestly, before you get in too deep with someone, you should definitely go on a road trip and travel long distance to make sure you're compatible. Even if it's just going to the next town over, you will learn so much about your partner. Please, just take that bit of advice and do it. Please. Let's think about traveling from an even wider net. Traveling also lets us see how the rest of the world lives and thrives, or in some cases struggles, under different geological and sociological conditions. We might like to believe that people are generally the same everywhere, but the truth is, where we grow up matters. In and outside of the United States, it can determine everything from our education levels, the jobs that are available to us, and the amount of wealth we can or cannot accumulate. It also determines the values and beliefs we've been exposed to and eventually adopt. When we travel to other places, especially those areas that are quite different from ours, it's hard to ignore this. Probably the best example of this is when you live in an affluent area and you travel to one less fortunate, or you go from a developed economy to an underdeveloped one. I didn't really see this until I traveled to the Bahamas. The airport on Nassau is on the other end of the island. The airport officials tell you not to get into any unmarked cars, and the hotels often provide transportation to the resort. As we got in our car marked to go to the Atlantis, it was apparent the rest of the island wasn't living in paradise. When we got to the resort, it was completely gated around the perimeter. They told us we could leave, but to be back before sunset because it wasn't safe. This was the first time that I got to see how other countries truly live. And that while it may be a vacation destination, not every place is a vacation all year round. It's easy to take for granted the luxuries of choice, comfort, and security when you constantly have them available to you. But when you travel to an area without many of these things, which are often considered basic conveniences, you're gonna notice. And while this may be an uncomfortable truth for us to swallow, I think it's important that we get to see for ourselves just what it's like, rather than depending on pictures in geographical magazines or slideshows from nonprofit organizations. This helps us build compassion for those in need and encourages us to make a difference where we can, but also gives us a chance to hear stories straight from the source. These stories, of course, are so important because they're not just about suffering, they're also about the triumph of the human spirit in situations that are less than ideal. However, not all travel needs to be for humanity's sake. We don't need to feel guilty about going to places just to have a good time or to fulfill a work obligation. There is still a lot to learn about the local culture and geography no matter where you go. This is true whether you travel domestically or internationally. Even in the United States, every region has its own personality. Some areas are more liberal or more conservative. Cuisines vary from place to place, and some of that comes from deep-rooted traditions unique to that area. There are many regions in the United States that were settled by people from the same heritage, and they have their own ways of letting that background shine through, while also being undeniably American. Folklore, too, is something that develops in each region. Everywhere has stories that shape the personality of the people and the place, that tell about the heroes and the myths and the mysteries of the land. Take West Virginia, for example, with the legend of the Mothman or Bigfoot in the Pacific Northwest. The only way to truly take advantage of these different regions and all that they have to offer is to just visit them and choose to embrace the local flavor. While in Mexico this year, Nikki and I had a few hours to kill before our snorkel adventure, so we went to the local museum in Cozumel. We learned how the island formed, what resources it had, and how people started inhabiting the area. You don't have to travel thousands of miles away to learn about culture. I implore you to check out your local museum. I bet you'll learn something new about the city you live in. I think learning about other people through travel is not just something that happens. It's something that we should actively seek out to better ourselves as members of society. Even if we're not on some sort of humanitarian crusade, we should be engaging with the locals when we have the opportunity to do so. Whether that means spending time in a popular brewery, rooting on the local sports team, or attending a cultural festival with a long history in the area. Learning about each other helps us strengthen the bonds of humanity and reinforces the idea that what happens to one of us happens to all of us. Now, unless we live in an area with a lot of diversity, lack of travel has a very big effect on the way we see people who are different from us, because we are rarely exposed to the various walks of life that others experience. I, for one, am extremely grateful to have grown up on the outskirts of Chicago. Each school I went to was incredibly diverse. I'd say probably 40 to 45% of the student body population was white. I thought all schools were like this. It wasn't until I graduated college and moved to South Carolina for my first big girl job that I realized how wrong I was. I met a few friends there that had absolutely terrible opinions. One of them said to me that she thought interracial couples were disgusting. I pried and asked her why she thought that way, and she said that was the way her mama raised her. I wanted to cry. I couldn't believe people even thought like this. Every time I questioned someone's terrible opinion, I was called a Yankee. Yes, like the term used for Northerners in the American Civil War. Legitimately called that in South Carolina. It was like another world. I couldn't believe how backwards their thought processes were, but I couldn't blame them if that's the environment that they constantly grew up in. They just didn't get to travel and have those diverse experiences that opened up their minds. It can be really easy to get tunnel vision when we focus on one way of life, especially if it's the only way of life we've ever known, even if it's unintentional. This focus has the ability to prevent us from taking any outside influence under consideration. From there, everything spirals. To put it bluntly, there is little good that can come from this. Yes, tradition is important. And yes, having a shared identity can bring people closer together. But no, these should not come at the expense of treating others who are different as if they don't belong or as if they aren't worthy to walk on the same section of the earth. And for some reason, it seems like we can't expect people to have compassion for outsiders when they haven't spent much time being the outsiders themselves, or haven't spent any considerable amount of time experiencing life from a different perspective. And sadly, this is all too frequent. What happens when you have a small group of people who've spent their entire lives in the same place? They develop this almost visceral need to protect their home space from any sort of change. And the more different someone else is, the more that person represents the change these natives are trying desperately to avoid. Of course, not everyone who lives their entire life in a small town is racist or shows prejudice to strangers coming into their community. And not every small town is inherently racist. And of course, we also can't say with any degree of certainty that traveling is the ultimate solution to end racism and prejudice, but seeing and engaging with people outside of our small communities would certainly be a step in the right direction. If people are content to stay in their lane and never challenge themselves to examine the world without their blinders on, it's unlikely that they'll ever feel the need to change. If we truly want to become a more compassionate world, not just for those who are less fortunate, but for humanity as a whole, we need to surround ourselves with the people who make up our world, forging connections wherever we are, wherever we go. They say your personality takes on the shape of the 5 people you talk to and engage with most, so noodle on that while you think about who makes up your circle of friends. Would your future self be proud of who you are today? All right, we've covered a lot today, from what we can learn by visiting new places to what can happen if we don't travel beyond our typical boundaries. Considering all of this, it's hard not to forget that travel itself is a luxury. We don't all have the ways and means to go from place to place. So how do we prevent ourselves from being stunted from that lack of exposure to others and the way they live? First, the internet is the world's largest network. It's a global connection that is beginning to reach even some of the most isolated areas of our planet. We can use it to strike up conversation with people who live thousands of miles away. We can send and receive photos or videos that share our lives with each other, what we do, what we eat, how we dress, and all of those little things in between. They can now be easily transmitted with the click of a button. It's not the same level of immersion that you'd experience actually leaving home and going to a new place, but it's a decent substitution to start. The percentage of people who live their entire lives where they were born is shrinking more and more. We're moving away from home, seeking new experiences and new relationships. Our colleagues are our friends, even our neighbors. They come from all over and have so much to teach us about where they've been, what they've seen. We just need to take a moment to ask and listen. All right, that concludes this episode of Something to Noodle On. I'd like to leave you with something to noodle on in your own life. So, how has traveling changed you as a person? Really think about it. Think about all the places you've been, what you've walked away with, those memories you've had. How has traveling changed you? Think about that and continue the conversation by joining our Discord or following us on Twitter at @apodtonoodleon. Thank you so much for listening. As always, you can find our episodes of Something to Noodle On wherever you get your podcasts. I'm your host, Mac and Cheese Please. You can call me Mac. Until next time, bye friends!